I'm telling you, keep your eyes open. We don't want any trouble in this county. If you see him, call me right away.
Some moments in life don't announce themselves with thunder or warning, they arrive quietly, tucked inside the everyday noise of a rainy Tuesday afternoon, wrapped in the familiar smell of burnt coffee and cheap bacon grease for Arthur Vance. That moment began when he pushed open the scratched glass door of a small, weather-beaten diner on the outskirts of Millfield, Pennsylvania. The bell above the door chimed with a dull, rusty cling. A sound that hadn't changed in 30 years. Arthur shook the rain from his dark canvas coat, pulled his faded baseball cap lower over his eyes, and stepped onto the scuffed linoleum floor. To anyone looking at him, he was just another tired, middle-aged man seeking shelter from the downpour, a traveler with mud on his boots and mileage on his soul. Nobody in that room had any reason to suspect that the quiet man sitting in the corner booth was actually the sole owner of Vance Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar real estate conglomerate that owned every square inch of the block, including the very diner he was standing in. Arthur didn't visit his properties in expensive tailored suits or with a retinue of legal advisors. He believed that if you truly wanted to know how a business was running, and more importantly, how the people inside it were being treated, you had to look at it through the eyes of someone who had nothing. He slid into the worn vinyl booth in the back, the cushions sinking deeply beneath his weight. The diner was sparse, filled with the soft hum of an old refrigerator unit and the gentle patter of heavy rain hitting the glass windows. A couple of truckers sat near the counter, conversing in low tones, while a radio in the kitchen played faint country music. Arthur placed his hands flat on the scratched formica table, looking around at the cracked tiles and yellowed wallpaper. This place was one of his father's original investments, a tiny spark that eventually ignited a global empire. He had kept it on the books for decades out of pure sentimentality, leaving its daily operations to a local management company. That was when she walked out from behind the stainless steel kitchen doors, carrying a fresh pot of steaming coffee. Her name was Clara. Her name tag was slightly tilted, pinned to a faded green uniform that had seen far better days. She looked to be in her late 20s, though her tired eyes carried the heavy weight of someone who had lived 3 lifetimes. She moved with a quick, efficient grace. Instantly noticing Arthur sitting in the corner, she grabbed a mug, pulled a laminated menu from behind the counter, and walked over to his table. Her voice was soft, warm, and genuinely welcoming as she greeted him, offering a fresh cup of coffee to take the chill off the rain. But as she leaned down to pour the hot liquid into his cup, the sleeve of her uniform pulled back slightly, and the harsh, fluorescent lights from above hit her skin directly. Arthur's hand froze midair as he went to adjust his cutlery. There, creeping up past her left wrist and disappearing beneath her rolled-up sleeve, were thick, purplish-yellow bruises that looked painfully fresh. And as she looked up to ask him what he'd like for lunch, the light caught the edge of her jawline beneath a heavy, carefully applied layer of cheap foundation. A dark, jagged shadow covered her cheekbone, extending down toward her neck. It wasn't the kind of mark left by a clumsy bump against a kitchen counter or an accidental fall. It bore the unmistakable shape of violent pressure, finger marks pressed with cruel force into soft skin. Clara immediately noticed where his gaze had rested. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced in an instant by a cold, sharp panic. She pulled her arm back so fast that a few drops of hot coffee splashed over the rim of the mug, spilling onto the dark formica. She fumbled with her apron, hastily pulling her sleeve back down to her wrist, her breathing suddenly shallow and uneven. She apologized repeatedly, her hands trembling as she grabbed a napkin from the dispenser to wipe up the spill. Arthur didn't move. He reached out gently, his voice quiet and completely devoid of judgment, telling her it was all right and that there was no need to apologize. He asked her if she was okay, keeping his tone as soft as possible so as not to alarm her or attract the attention of the few other patrons in the diner. Clara kept her eyes fixed firmly on the table, frantically wiping the same small spot over and over again. She forced a hollow, practiced smile onto her lips and told him that she was just clumsy, that she had tripped on the basement stairs while hauling heavy boxes of potatoes earlier that morning. It was a story she had clearly rehearsed, uttered with the practiced speed of someone who had spent a long time convincing the world, and perhaps herself, that everything was fine. But Arthur was not a man easily fooled. He had grown up in a hard neighborhood before building his fortune, and he knew what trauma looked like. He knew the distinct difference between an accident and an assault. More importantly, he saw the deep, lingering terror mirrored in her eyes, a fear that had nothing to do with spilling a few drops of coffee. Before Arthur could say another word, the swinging double doors of the kitchen burst open with an aggressive bang. A tall, heavily built man in his late 30s stepped out into the dining room. He wore a grease-stained apron over a tight black t-shirt, his broad shoulders squared and his face fixed in a permanent scowl. His name was Marcus, the diner's line cook and head supervisor. Hired 3 years ago by Arthur's regional management agency, Marcus didn't just walk into the room. He dominated it, his heavy boots thudding loudly against the floorboards. His narrow, dark eyes swept across the diner, locking immediately onto Clara standing beside Arthur's booth. Marcus's voice boomed across the small restaurant. Sharp and dripping with condescension, he demanded to know why Clara was wasting time chatting up the customers when there were orders waiting in the back and dirty dishes piling up in the sink. Clara visibly flinched at the sound of his voice. The color completely drained from her face, making the hidden bruise on her cheek appear even darker beneath her makeup. She dropped her gaze to the floor, murmured a soft apology, and quickly turned to head toward the kitchen. But Marcus didn't let her pass smoothly. As she walked by him, he stepped directly into her path, leaning down and muttering something in a harsh, low whisper right into her ear. Arthur watched intently from his booth, noticing how Clara's entire body went rigid, her hands clenching into tight fists at her sides as she nodded submissively and hurried behind the kitchen doors. Marcus turned around, his chest puffed out, and cast a long, lingering look toward Arthur's booth, establishing his authority before turning back toward the kitchen. The air in the diner had shifted entirely, growing thick with tension. Arthur sat in silence, his mind racing. He had come here simply to inspect an old asset, expecting to check on maintenance records and sample the daily special. Instead, he was sitting in the middle of an invisible nightmare happening right under his roof, funded by his own enterprise. He pulled out his phone beneath the table, discreetly typing a message to his head of security, David, a former intelligence officer who managed Arthur's private security detail. The text was simple: run a full background check on Marcus, the head cook at the Millfield Diner. I need everything you can find within the hour. 10 minutes later, Clara returned to the table, carrying a plate with a simple club sandwich and a side of fries. Her movements were stiff, like a marionette being pulled by invisible, painful strings. She set the plate down without making direct eye contact, her fingers visibly shaking as she placed a bottle of ketchup next to his meal. Arthur looked at the sandwich, then looked up at her face. He didn't ask her about the bruises again directly. He knew pushing too hard in public would only cause her to retreat further into her shell or put her in greater danger. Instead, he asked her how long she had worked at the diner. Clara paused, taking a subtle step back toward the hallway so she remained out of Marcus's line of sight. Through the kitchen window, she answered softly, saying she had been here for 4 years. She explained that she used to live in the next town over, but had moved to Millfield after her mother passed away. She worked 6 days a week, often taking double shifts just to keep up with her rent and medical bills. When Arthur asked her if the management treated her well, Clara bit her lower lip. Her gaze flicked nervously toward the kitchen before she answered in a whisper, saying that jobs were hard to come by in a town like this, and that you learned to be grateful for whatever you had, even if the conditions weren't ideal. Her words were interrupted by a sharp buzz in Arthur's pocket. It was a reply from David. Arthur looked down at the screen, keeping his expression entirely neutral. The security report revealed that Marcus had a long history of aggressive behavior and had been fired from 3 previous kitchens for verbal harassment and physical altercations. Yet, remarkably, he had been promoted to supervisor at this diner 6 months ago, receiving glowing evaluations in his personnel file. Even more disturbing was a brief note from David stating that the diner's previous owner, an elderly woman who had run the place for 20 years, had suddenly retired 6 months ago under mysterious circumstances, selling her remaining managerial shares directly to a local holding company tied to Marcus's family. Arthur lowered the phone, a cold realization washing over him. Something systemic was happening here. This wasn't just a case of abusive cook picking on a vulnerable waitress. There was a layer of corruption wrapping around this small diner, hiding behind official paperwork and silent threats. He looked back up at Clara, who was currently clearing a table nearby. She moved with such quiet dignity despite the obvious pain she was in, carefully wiping down the tables, smiling gently at an elderly regular who had just walked in. Making sure everyone else was taken care of while her own world was falling apart, Arthur took a bite of his meal, his brain working through every angle of the situation. He couldn't just stand up, declare who he was, and fire Marcus on the spot. That might solve the immediate problem in the restaurant, but it wouldn't protect Clara once the sun went down and the restaurant closed. Men like Marcus didn't simply walk away when confronted with authority. They lashed out at those they perceived as weaker. If Arthur was going to intervene, he had to do it surgically. He needed to find out the full extent of what was happening, ensure Clara's safety, and tear down whatever network of intimidation Marcus was using to control her. As the afternoon wore on, the rain outside intensified, hammering against the glass windows in relentless waves. The diner slowly emptied until Arthur was the only customer remaining in the booth. Clara made her rounds, refilling his coffee mug once more. This time, Arthur spoke to her in a low, even tone, asking her a simple question. Why didn't she leave? He asked it not with judgment, but with genuine empathy. Clara stopped, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the question was too heavy to hold up any longer. She glanced toward the kitchen door to ensure Marcus was busy, then leaned in slightly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the rain. She told him that leaving wasn't an option. It wasn't just about the money. Though she was barely surviving on her wages, she revealed that Marcus wasn't just her supervisor at work. He was her late mother's stepson, a man who had manipulated his way into controlling her family's estate. After her mother passed away, he held the lease to her small apartment, controlled her work schedule, and had spent the last 2 years systematically cutting her off from every friend and support system she had ever known. He had convinced her that if she ever tried to leave, or if she ever reported him to the police, he would use his connections in the local precinct to make sure she ended up with nothing. Framed for theft from the diner's cash register, the psychological cage Marcus had built around her was far stronger than the physical violence he used to enforce it. He had stripped away her independence piece by piece until she believed she had nowhere left to run. Arthur listened in silence, feeling a profound anger burning deep within his chest. He saw in Clara the same quiet resilience his own mother had possessed years ago, when they were struggling to survive on the streets. He knew that the hardest part of escaping a predator wasn't finding a door. It was finding the courage to believe that something better existed on the other side. Just as Clara finished speaking, the kitchen door swung open again. Marcus walked out, holding a clipboard and looking noticeably agitated. He didn't like seeing Clara talking to the same customer for so long. He marched over to the booth, his heavy frame looming over Arthur, his tone cold and aggressive. He demanded to know if there was a problem with the food, or if the guest was just taking up space without ordering anything else. The hostility was palpable, a clear attempt to intimidate Arthur into paying his bill and leaving. Arthur didn't flinch. He slowly raised his eyes, meeting Marcus's glare with a cold, unyielding stare that caught the larger man completely off guard. Arthur didn't raise his voice. He simply asked Marcus why he felt it was necessary to speak to his staff with such disrespect. Marcus laughed bitterly, taking a step closer, mocking Arthur for trying to play the hero in a place he didn't understand. Marcus declared that this was his diner, these were his employees, and he could run the business however he saw fit. He told Arthur to pay his check and get out before he personally threw him into the rain. Clara stepped between them, her face pale, desperately pleading with Marcus not to cause a scene, promising that she would get back to work immediately. Marcus roughly shoved her arm aside, telling her to keep her mouth shut. That single gesture, the casual, unthinking physical aggression, was the final straw for Arthur. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a pristine black business card embossed with silver lettering, and laid it flat on the table between them. He told Marcus to call the number on that card immediately, or prepare to have his entire life disassembled within the next 24 hours. Marcus picked up the card with a sneer, but as his eyes scanned the silver text, Arthur Vance, Chief Executive Officer, Vance International Enterprises, the sneer slowly began to wither on his face. He looked from the card to the quiet, unpretentious man sitting in the booth, his mind struggling to connect the wealthy real estate tycoon whose name was stamped on every official document in the corporate office with the rain-soaked stranger sitting before him. Panic flickered behind Marcus's eyes, but he quickly tried to mask it with arrogance, claiming the card was a fake and that anyone could print a piece of paper with a rich man's name on it. Arthur didn't bother arguing. He simply picked up his phone, placed it on speaker, and dialed a number. Within 2 seconds. A voice came through the speaker, clear, sharp, and authoritative. It was David, calling from the corporate headquarters. Arthur instructed David to initiate an immediate emergency audit of the Millfield Diner franchise, suspend all local management contracts effective instantly, and dispatch the company's legal counsel along with an independent security detail to the site. The voice on the phone responded instantly, confirming that teams were already en route and would arrive within 20 minutes. The silence that followed in the diner was absolute. The regular, who was sitting near the entrance, slowly got up, paid his tab at the register, and slipped out the door. Sensing that something seismic was taking place, Marcus stood frozen, his face shifting from anger to genuine confusion and mounting terror. Clara stared at Arthur, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming shock. She couldn't comprehend how the soft-spoken customer she had served a cup of coffee to just an hour ago had suddenly summoned an army of legal and financial power with a single phone call. Arthur stood up from the booth. Stepping out into the aisle, he looked at Clara, his voice dropping back down to that same warm, reassuring tone he had used when he first arrived. He told her that she no longer had to be afraid of Marcus, nor did she ever have to worry about losing her home, her job, or her safety ever again. He explained that he owned the land, the building, and the company that managed it, and that he was taking personal responsibility for fixing everything that had been broken under his watch. However, the major reveal of the day was far from over. As they waited for the legal team to arrive, Arthur asked Clara to sit down in the booth with him. He needed to tell her something that wasn't in any corporate report or financial ledger. He asked her about her mother's maiden name, a name that hadn't been spoken in that diner for years. When Clara uttered the name, Arthur closed his eyes for a brief moment, a quiet wave of emotion passing across his worn face. He revealed to her that 30 years ago, before he made his billions, before Vance Holdings was even a concept, he was a broke, desperate young man stranded in Millfield during a brutal winter. He had walked into this very diner with no money in his pockets, freezing and hopeless. The waitress working the counter that night had seen his distress, pulled him into a corner booth, and fed him a warm meal out of her own pocket, giving him $20 and a few words of encouragement that kept him going when he wanted to give up. That waitress was Clara's mother. Arthur had spent years trying to track down the woman who had saved his life during his darkest hour, only to discover years later that she had passed away. He had bought the diner as a tribute to her memory, intending to keep it open forever as a sanctuary for people who needed a safe place. But due to his corporate expansion and reliance on distant management companies, he had lost track of the day-to-day reality of the diner, completely unaware that the daughter of the woman who had saved him was being tormented within the very walls he owned. Clara sat in stunned silence as tears filled her eyes, rolling down her bruised cheeks. The realization that her mother's kindness from decades ago had spun through time to bring a protector back to her booth left her completely breathless. The invisible cage that Marcus had built around her shattered instantly, replaced by the profound realization that she was no longer alone, that her mother's legacy of love and empathy had reached across the years to rescue her when she needed it most. Within 15 minutes, black SUVs pulled up to the curb outside the diner, their headlights cutting through the heavy rain. Security officers and legal representatives stepped inside, taking control of the premises. Marcus was immediately served with formal notices, stripped of his authority, and escorted off the property to face a comprehensive financial audit and criminal investigation into his actions. The corporate machinery that had once felt so cold and distant was now moving with absolute precision to protect Clara and restore justice. In the days that followed, Arthur ensured that Clara received full medical care and immediate legal protection, guaranteeing that her housing and finances were entirely secured under her own name. But he didn't just hand her a settlement. He gave her ownership of the diner itself, transferring the deed directly into her name so she could run it with the same compassion, dignity, and warmth that her mother had shown decades prior. The story ends not in a grand corporate office, but back inside that small diner on a bright, sunlit afternoon. A few weeks later, the air inside no longer felt heavy or tense. It was filled with genuine laughter, the sound of sizzling food, and the cozy aroma of fresh coffee. Clara stood behind the counter, her skin clear, her smile bright and real, welcoming guests with open arms. Arthur sat in the same corner booth, watching her thrive, Holding a warm cup of coffee in his hands, life has a strange, beautiful way of coming full circle, reminding us that no act of kindness, no matter how small or hidden it may seem, is ever truly lost in the wind. The good we put out into the world has a way of finding its way back to us, often precisely when we need it most.